Hello everyone and welcome to StudyIQ. In this lecture, we will discuss about Reserve Bank of India's report on state finances. Recently, the Reserve Bank of India has brought out a report on state finances. This report talks about the status of finance in the states of this country. So in this lecture, we will be discussing about the highlights of this report, the causes or reasons for the issues which are mentioned in the report, and also the Reserve Bank of India has come up with certain suggestions in order to overcome these issues. So we will be discussing all this in this lecture. But before we move on to the lecture, I would like to explain a few terms to you in order to make more clarity when we discuss this topic. The first term is gross fiscal deficit or GFD. Gross fiscal deficit means excess of total expenditure over the revenue receipts and also non-debt capital receipts. So it is excess of expenditure over revenue receipts plus non-debt capital receipts. This is gross fiscal deficit. And what would be net fiscal deficit? NFD. NFD means gross fiscal deficit minus net lending of the central government. Minus the lending of central government will give NFD or net fiscal deficit. The third term is outstanding liabilities. Outstanding liabilities means liabilities that is yet to be paid. For example, income received in advance. Advance income is an example of advance liabilities or outstanding liability. Another important term that we will discuss in this lecture is primary deficit. We have already seen what is fiscal deficit. So, fiscal deficit minus interest payments will give you primary deficit. Fiscal deficit means excess of expenditure over the revenue, and when we reduce the interest payments from this expenditure, we will get a certain expenditure. So fiscal deficit minus interest payments will give primary deficit. So these are certain terms we are going to discuss during this lecture. So a clarity with regard to these terms are important if you need to understand the topic in detail. Now moving on to the topic. Let us see what are the highlights of the Reserve Bank of India's report on state finances. The first one, Reserve Bank of India has warned that many states may face fiscal risk this year. So what is meant by fiscal risk? It means the fiscal deficit of the states will go up, and after crossing a certain limit, this fiscal deficit will become a risk, which means the repayment or managing of this fiscal deficit would be difficult. So many states would be facing this risk, which means the fiscal deficit of the states will go up, and this would be beyond the managerial capacity of the states. So that is the first highlight. Secondly, the states have budgeted a gross fiscal deficit to GDP ratio of 2.7%. We have seen what is gross fiscal deficit. So GFD is to GDP. GDP ratio would be 2.7%. So the gross fiscal deficit would be 2.7% of the GDP in the year 2017-18. This is the budgeted estimate. And coming to 2018-19, the estimated GFD to GDP ratio for 18-19 is 2.6%. We have seen in 17-18 it is 2.7, and 18-19 it is going to be 2.6% of GDP. And now when we look at 2017-18, we will see that for 3 consecutive years, the GFD to GDP ratio has crossed the threshold. It means the government had put certain limit or threshold. But with the estimates of 2017-18, it is clear that for the 3 consecutive years, which means from 2014-15, 15-16, 16-17, 17-18. So if we take the previous years from 2015 to 18, for 3 consecutive financial years, we will see the threshold has been crossed. Another highlight of this report is that the outstanding liabilities of the states. We have seen what is outstanding liability. Liability that has to be paid, yet to be paid. So outstanding liabilities of states grew at double digits. And when it comes to market borrowings, the highest market borrowers are Maharashtra, UP, Tamil Nadu and West Bengal. So these states borrow largely from the market. And major borrowers among special category states. So certain states are given the special category status, and among the special category states, the major borrowers are Assam, Himachal Pradesh, Jammu and Kashmir and Uttarakhand. So these are the major borrowers among special category states. So if we look at the highlights, we will understand that many states are in the risk of higher fiscal deficit. The expenditure of the states are more than the revenue of the states. And now let us see what are the reasons for this increased fiscal deficit or the fiscal risk for the states. First reason is shortfall in on tax revenue collection. The tax revenue collected in different states are very less compared to the expenditure. And the economic survey this year has highlighted that the federal governments, that is the states, and also local governments, the urban local government and the rural local government, they underperform when it comes to the utilization of their own resources. So it can also include the tax resources they have. So it is clear from the economic survey that the states as well as the local governments are underutilizing their capacity for tax collection. So there is a shortfall in on tax revenue. This along with increased revenue expenditure will lead to increase in fiscal deficit. So on one hand, the revenue of the states coming down, and on the other hand, the expenditure of the states going up. So this will means fiscal deficit is widening. So fiscal deficit means the excess of expenditure over revenue. So two things. One, when the expenditure goes up, fiscal deficit will increase, and also when the revenue comes down, fiscal deficit will increase. But when both this happen simultaneously, that is when the expenditure increasing and revenue decreasing, the fiscal deficit will widen. And another reason is the state budgets are under pressure. What are the reasons for this? First reason is commitment of the states to meet the expenditure of the pay commission awards. So the pay commission has recommended for increase in salaries or awards, and the states have to keep this commitment. So one reason is the pay commission awards which has increased the salaries. So state governments have to meet this target. So that is one reason the state budgets are under pressure. Second one is interest payments. On various borrowings, the state governments have to pay back the interest. So this is also a major cause of concern. Thirdly, different states have different state-specific schemes. For example, some states which are highly dependent on agriculture, sometimes the states will come up with schemes like farm loan waivers, or some states which promote manufacturing will come up with subsidies in order to promote manufacturing. So states have state-specific schemes, and the expenditure on state-specific schemes is an additional burden for the states. So this is a public spending, and when there is an increased public spending, the fiscal deficit will increase. Also under the Uday scheme, that is Ujjwal Discom Assurance Yojana, under the Uday scheme, the state governments had issued bonds from 2015. In 2015-16 and 16-17, different state governments have issued Uday bonds. So this is also one reason for pressure on state budgets. So all this together will widen the fiscal deficit. And another major reason is market borrowings by the state governments. After 2008 global financial crisis, the market borrowings of different state governments have increased. And what is the reason for this? There is an additional fiscal space given to states as a part of the stimulus package. So after the financial crisis, there should be a recovery. And in order to boost this recovery, a stimulus package was adopted, and according to the stimulus package, additional fiscal space was given to states. That means states can increase the fiscal deficit. Why? Because the expenditure of the states should be increased in order to cope up with the shortfalls of the financial crisis. The financial crisis would have affected the states, and in order to overcome the issues or problems caused by the global financial crisis, the states were given a fiscal space, that is expenditure can be increased in order to recover from the crisis. Now, the Reserve Bank of India has given certain suggestions in order to overcome the problem of fiscal deficit. Let us see what are the suggestions. First one is reducing the leakages and also enhancing the efficiency of public distribution system. The public distribution system is one major expenditure for every state government. The food security of a state is ensured through the public distribution system. The public distribution system or the PDS makes food commodities available at subsidized cost. Therefore, the affordability is increased and also the nutrient intake is increased through the public distribution system. So, public distribution system is one expenditure that you cannot forego, and every state have a public distribution system. But what is the problem with the public distribution system? There is huge leakages. That means this system is not proper. There are leakages in between, and also the efficiency of the system is very less. So, if we reduce the leakages and enhance the efficiency, what will happen? The expenditure on the public distribution system will come down, and also this system will give better results. So, this is the first suggestion given by the Reserve Bank of India in order to reduce the fiscal deficit for the states. And secondly, expenditure of the states must be rationalized. What is meant by rationalization of expenditures? Every state will have different expenditures. So, the demands of people in different states would be different, and there will be a wide number of expenditures for a state. But what the state has to do is rationalize, which means the resources or the expenditure must be put on the basis of priority. So, prioritization is very important. The demands or the needs for a state must be calculated, and according to the output that each expenditure can provide, there should be prioritization of expenditure. Certain expenditures will be providing better results, better output, better productivity. Certain expenditures would be very necessary, very important, which a state cannot forego. For example, education, health, the public distribution system, etc. Such things are very essential. These expenditures we cannot forego, and there will be certain other expenditures which would be providing better results, better outputs. So, such expenditures has to be met. You cannot forego them. But there would be certain other expenditures that are lesser important. So, this less important expenditures or those expenditures which provide lesser utility must be avoided. So, expenditure of the states must be rationalized, and resources must be dedicated to those expenditures which can bring better results in the economy. Thirdly, the public financial management practices should be improved. There should be better management of the public finances. The public finance means the government finance, the state government's financial resources. This should be better managed. This should be rationalized. This will rebuild the fiscal space. If there is a better management of the financial resources, the fiscal deficit will come down, because the unwanted expenditures can be avoided. Only the necessary or most important expenditures are met if there is a proper public financial management. So, this is another suggestion given by the Reserve Bank of India. Also, the state governments must focus on fiscal reforms. Fiscal reforms means the borrowings should come down. Fiscal word itself means the public purse. Fisc means public purse. So, fiscal reforms means those reforms which are aimed at reforming the or changing the public expenditure or the government expenditure. So, the government is meeting its expenditures through borrowings. So, what will happen when there is a fiscal deficit? Under fiscal deficit, the expenditure of the government is more than the revenue. And with this increased expenditure, how will the government meet the expenditure? This is done through government borrowings. So, if borrowings come down, it will reduce the fiscal deficit. More the borrowings, more will be fiscal deficit. So, fiscal reforms necessarily means bringing down the borrowings of the government. And when the borrowings of the government comes down, this will reduce the debt burden of the government. So, one major expenditure is interest expenditure or the repayment of debt and also the interest payment on this debt. So, if the debt itself comes down, this will reduce the expenditure of the government. So, fiscal reforms are very important. Fiscal reforms means borrowings should come down. So, when borrowings come down, there are two advantages. One is that the fiscal deficit directly comes down because the excess of expenditure is met by borrowings. So, if borrowings are less, it means there is a direct impact on the fiscal deficit. And secondly, the indirect impact is that there must be some debt and also interest on debt. With reduced borrowing, this debt payments and also interest payment on the debt will come down. Thereby, indirectly the fiscal deficit will come down because the expenditure of the government has come down. So, fiscal reforms are very important. And another suggestion is larger and also faster corrections in primary deficit. We have already seen what is primary deficit. Fiscal deficit minus interest payments is primary deficit. Under the fiscal reforms, we have seen borrowings cause increase in fiscal deficit. But under the primary deficit, these borrowings are not taken into consideration because interest payments are not considered while making the primary deficit. So, if we reduce interest payments from fiscal deficit, we will arrive at primary deficit. So, reforms or corrections in primary deficit means that expenditures other than borrowings should be corrected. This can be in the form of developmental expenditure of the government, social sector expenditure of the government, welfare schemes of the government, etc. So, the governments need to rationalize the expenditures other than borrowings. This should also be a larger focus of the state governments. And another important suggestion is to adhere to the FRBM target. FRBM means fiscal responsibility and budgetary management. So the FRBM is targeting to bring down the fiscal deficit. And according to the FRBM target, it stipulates a target of 20% for the state. The state debt to GDP ratios should be 20% by the year 2024-25. That is the target of FRBM. The overall debt of the state should be 20% in proportion to the GDP, gross domestic product. So, if we try to adhere to this FRBM target and thereby reducing the expenditure of the state governments, this will also help in bringing down the fiscal deficit of the states. So, in short, we can say that according to the Reserve Bank of India's report on state finances, many states in India are poorly performing with regard to fiscal deficit. That means the expenditure of many states is higher than the revenue of the states, leading to higher borrowings, higher debts, etc. The suggestions provided by the Reserve Bank of India will help in better management of the finances of the government. You can find all my current affair lectures on my Facebook page, and also I have done the economic survey series. Those links are also available on my Facebook page. Thank you.